It is an incredible blessing for me to be here. I know many people have seen my bio in your program tonight. Maybe you have caught me on social media or the internet. You know, lots of people say, gosh, she looks familiar. Lots of people have seen a video that came about last fall when I testified before the House of Representatives. I think it had 3 or 4 million hits on YouTube a few months ago. So if you've heard parts of my story before, yes, this is who your speaker is tonight. And I know lots of people know me because of what I've gone through in my life. But what I hope you take away from tonight is kind of like the work of Bridgehaven. There's so much more to the story. Lots of people know me because I've survived an abortion. But what lots of people don't recognize is that my story is one of transformation. I had a set of dreams long before I ever knew them. And God took those dreams and he expanded them. And I'm not sure if you saw this quote tonight, but I had to write it down. God's gifts put man's best plans to shame. That was on the screen tonight. God's gifts put man's best plans to shame by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And that is the story of my life that I am here to share with you tonight. Yes, my life was meant to be ended by an abortion, but God's plans were so much more than that. And now I am blessed to travel around the world sharing my story of God's grace, of redemption and restoration and reconciliation plans that he has for each and every one of our lives. And what some of you may also know about me is that I'm actually an Iowa native. Woohoo is right. I now live in Kansas City. Don't hold it against me. It was my husband's idea. We live in Kansas City with our 2 daughters, and we have an 8-year-old and a 21-month-old. But I am blessed to be an Iowa native, and I am grateful for all of the incredible work that not only Bridgehaven does here in your community, but so many of you are doing across the state. And my life story actually started on the other side of the state nearly 39 years ago. Anybody ever been to Sioux City? Chances are pretty good, right? Thank goodness. Usually when I'm somewhere and I say I'm from Iowa, they go, huh? And then when they start to figure it out, they go, oh. And I laugh along with them. All kidding aside, though, 39 years ago, it was a very unplanned, unexpected thing that happened in my biological mother's life. I know that my biological mother fits most statistics when it comes to abortion. I know that my biological mother looked an awful lot like the women who come through the doors of Bridgehaven still today. My biological mother was 19 years old. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father. And sadly, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that maybe some of you aren't even aware of. And that's the one that involves coercion. It's very interesting that we live in a society that often talks about abortion being a choice and a right. But when we peel back those terms, what we actually find is that so many women have so little choice when it comes to that decision. Over 64% of women in our world today identify being coerced into their abortion. 64%. So it isn't their choice. Someone else makes that choice for them or puts them in that position that abortion is the only option made available to them. One of the very reasons why Bridgehaven is so important, because they are providing true choices, true support to women in need, just like my biological mother. Sadly, what I've learned in recent years is that my birth mother wasn't just coerced into her abortion, though. I now know that she was literally forced against her will to undergo the saline infusion abortion that was meant to end my life and forever changed hers. And I know it's not a pleasant thing to hear about on a night like this when we are celebrating the life-saving, life-transforming work of this ministry. But I need to share with you just a little bit about the procedure that was forced upon my birth mother. That saline infusion abortion involved injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding me in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution was to scald me to death from the outside in. If you look it up on the internet and read more about it, you'll read about how that procedure usually lasted about 72 hours. The child soaked in that toxic salt solution while they were slowly burned to death. And then premature labor was induced with the intent of that deceased child being delivered. What I know in my own case, though, is that I actually didn't soak in that toxic salt solution for just 3 days. My medical records indicate that I soaked in it for 5. 5 days I soaked in that toxic salt solution, while they tried numerous times to induce my biological mother's labor and ultimately dispel my dead body from the womb. I think we can all agree that what happened to me over those 5 days was horrific, right? But I hope that you can also agree with me that what happened to my biological mother over those 5 days was equally horrific. That's why I do what I do. That's why Bridgehaven does what it does. I hope that's why you're here tonight. Not so that more children, just more children like me, can come into this world, but so that more women like my biological mother can have a dramatically different experience. Over those 5 days, she and I were subjected to that abortion procedure. And on the 5th day of that procedure, her premature labor was finally induced with me. That day in 1977 was meant to be the day that I was delivered right across the state in Sioux City, Iowa at St. Luke's Hospital. That was the day I was supposed to be delivered there as a successful abortion, a deceased child. As hard as it is to reflect on those things, I think we can all take great joy in recognizing God clearly had other plans that day, didn't he? Amen? I love how his plans can far outweigh our dreams for ourselves. And as you're going to hear about tonight, truly it's a miraculous thing that I'm alive. And God has continued to perform miracle after miracle in my life. And one of the things that I was first told, though, about the miracle of my life is that after I was delivered there at St. Luke's Hospital, the abortionist looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left there to die. Some of you have probably caught that as I testified before Congress and spoke about that. You know, sadly, I am not the first child in our great country that has happened to. And sadly, I am also not the last child that has happened to. The saddest part for me, though, is the truth about what really happened that day. You see, there was a very important person who was behind that forced abortion. That very same person was responsible for my delivery that day and demanded that I be left to die. It wasn't the abortionist. It was my grandmother, my biological mother's mother. She was a prominent nurse there in the Sioux City community. She is the one who was responsible for forcing that abortion upon her own daughter, and then delivering her firstborn grandchild in a final step of the abortion procedure. She still looked upon my live birth and demanded that I be left there to die. And I know that it's shocking. I'm sure you can imagine how shocking it is for me to live with the reality of my life. And I think we live in a culture that often expects me to hate her for the decisions she made about my life. But I'm here to tell you something very different tonight. I love her. I love her in that radical way that Jesus loves each and every one of us. You know, that way that doesn't always make sense. We can't always wrap our head or our heart around it. That's the way I love her. And no matter what decision she was making about my life that day, I am forever grateful that somehow there were 2 nurses on staff at St. Luke's Hospital who found out about the secret abortion and the little girl who was being left to die. And those 2 nurses fought for medical care to be provided to me. I am so thankful. And I know that not all of us will ever be put in a position like that. But think about the work of Bridgehaven every single day. They are performing the work that those nurses did for me. They are standing in the gap, and they are fighting for lives like mine to be saved. But they are fighting for lives like mine to be saved by loving the women and the men who come through their doors. And love changes things, doesn't it? I know that medical care changed my life, but I also know those nurses and all those medical professionals thereafter, they loved me. And because they were willing to fight for me, because they loved me, I was transformed into the woman that I am today. And you would never know by looking at me tonight, right? That I should have been scalded to death in the womb. You would never know by looking at me tonight that when I first survived that abortion, the prognosis for my life was very poor. When I was delivered, the doctors believed that my birth mother had been 20 weeks pregnant or less with me. But the fact that I was able to live and I weighed a little less than 3 pounds, I was a whopping 2 pounds, 14 ounces when I survived. That reflected to those medical professionals that she was much further along than what the abortionist had either believed or wanted to admit to. And one of the first notations in my medical records is that I looked like I was about 31 weeks gestational age when I survived. 31 weeks. But there I was, this little 2 pound, 14 ounce girl fighting for my life. I suffered from severe respiratory and liver problems. I suffered from seizures for an extended period of time. If you see pictures of me on the internet, you'll see that my head was shaved from temple to temple because I had IV lines running throughout my body. And the doctors made a couple points about my life very clear from early on. First of all, in case you're wondering, there is no medical reason why anybody like me exists in this world. And I don't know about you, but I am okay with that, right? No offense to any of the doctors in this room, but I know who the greatest physician truly is. And I'm so thankful. And the doctors also made it clear they didn't think I was going to continue to live for very long. And if I did live past my infancy, I was going to suffer from multiple disabilities throughout my life, ranging from blindness and deafness to having emotional and mental disabilities. Which leaves you all staring uncomfortably at me right now, right? I can feel it. You can probably guess that I get this a lot. Lots of people say, "Oh, is there something wrong with her that we can't see?" This is when I have to ask my family to be quiet. They know too much. They're laughing about it right now. You can probably guess by the fact that they can laugh about it, that no matter what the doctor said about what my life was going to look like, I'm standing here tonight, perfectly healthy and whole. Like I said, it is a miracle. And it is a miracle that my parents were brought into my life, not far from here. You'll catch my mom and dad, my adoptive parents, as I have to call them in public so people know who I'm talking about. You'll catch my mom and dad sometimes on interviews talk about how the first time they met me, I was still lying in an incubator at the University of Iowa hospitals, full of tubes and wires, fighting for my life. And you'll hear my parents talk about how that first time they laid eyes on me, they fell in love with me. I am 39 years old and I still get choked up thinking about my parents falling in love with me. And I want that for every child in our world, don't you? I want every child to have the opportunity for someone to fall in love with them the way my parents fell in love with me. I want every parent to have the opportunity to fall in love with their child. Think about the work of Bridgehaven for a minute. They are allowing children to have the opportunity to be loved, just like my parents fell in love with me. Think about how many parents have the opportunity to fall in love with their child, whether it's a biological parent or an adoptive parent, because of this ministry. To me, it just doesn't get any better than that. And as I shared a little bit ago, I truly believe that love changes things. Love transforms each and every one of our lives. First of all, through the love of Christ, and then the love of the people that he puts on our path. And my parents loved me. They loved me so well that I was healed enough to go home to them less than 3 months after surviving that abortion. And I grew up knowing that I was loved. I grew up knowing that adoption was an amazing blessing. You know, I'm always the first person to admit adoption is not the solution to an unplanned pregnancy. But what it is an option that should always be talked about and considered. You know, to me, I know that adoption carries grief. It causes difficulty, whether you're the adoptee or the adoptive parent or the biological parent. But no matter how difficult it can be some days, adoption is the option that everyone can live with. Everyone can live with that option. And I was so grateful to hear the story of adoption placement already tonight. What an amazing blessing. And we knew that in our family. We, and by we I mean my sister and I, who's also adopted, grew up knowing that we were loved. And not just by our adoptive parents, not just by God, but we were infinitely loved by our biological parents. Our mom and dad raised us to know that our birth parents loved us so much that not only did they give us life, but they gave us the gift of our amazing family. So here, adoption is the fabric of our family. Our parents struggled with infertility for over 15 years of their marriage. And then, lo and behold, all those years later, along came my little brother. And as you can tell by the look on my face, he's not adopted. And you can catch my brother sometimes talk about what it was like to be the biological child in the family. He kind of grew up feeling like the odd man out. And my family can attest to this. You know, he knew that we were loved so much by our parents. And I'm so grateful that we knew that growing up. What I quite obviously didn't know was the backstory that led to my adoption. And the truth is, I was never supposed to find out the story of my life. My parents loved me enough that they wanted to protect me from that truth, knowing that it had the great opportunity to change things and not in a good way. So they kept it a secret. But God intended for me to know the story of my life. And he allowed it to come forward when I was 14 years old in a very unplanned, unexpected kind of way. My older sister faced her own unplanned pregnancy as a high school student. And even though we were raised in a home to know about the gift of life and the gift of adoption, like so many women, my sister had fears. I'm sure her fears mirror those of the women that come through the doors of Bridgehaven today. But I am thankful that no matter how scared my sister was about her circumstances, she always knew that there was somebody she could turn to, and that was our parents. But I don't take that for granted in today's world, and I hope that you don't either. Not everyone has a supportive friend or family member to turn to in their time of need. That's hopefully where you come in. But that's also where Bridgehaven comes in every single day. They are that supportive person to anyone in need. And it makes all the difference in the world to have somebody to support you and love you, doesn't it? You know, I think we've seen that already in the videos tonight. And my sister is living proof of that. You know, it was about 24 years ago, almost 25 now, that my sister faced that unplanned pregnancy. It was about 25 years ago that she told our parents about her pregnancy. Our parents felt called at that time to tell her the story of my survival, hoping that it would make a difference, hoping that she would understand the depths of that decision that she was considering. I'm happy to tell you that my oldest nephew is about 24 years old. And he's an amazing man. He's an amazing father. And he knows that he could have been yet another statistic, but he knows much more importantly that God had a plan for him. And he was planned for just such a time as that, because it was time for me to know the story of my life. And after my sister found out the story of my survival, some of you can see where this is heading. Like any good teenage sister, she didn't keep it a secret from me. I'm guessing some of you have had teenage sisters, or you know some, right? You know, I often have to make it clear, my sister didn't tell me everything about my life story. I actually don't think I would have believed her if she would have shared it with me. But what she did do was encourage me to ask our parents for more to the story of my life. And lots of people ask me in hindsight now, you know, Melissa, didn't you ever see this coming? Didn't you ever feel different? No. I think I could shout that from the rooftops. No, I never felt this different. No, at the age of 14, I didn't know that abortions could fail and children could live. And even if I knew those things, I never would have thought for a second that somebody like that would be me. And so I didn't see it coming that night. I sat down with my mother for hours. And in the midst of talking, the words finally fell out of her mouth. She said, "Missy, your biological mother had an abortion during her pregnancy with you, and you survived it." And there are no words. Decades later, I still have no words to tell you what that night was like in my life, except complete and utter devastation. If it's possible to feel every human emotion at once, I felt it that night. And I am not too prideful to admit that I was angry. I was angry that night, because I couldn't understand how anybody could make that kind of decision about my life. But I share that with you because, more importantly, I didn't stay angry for very long, because the Holy Spirit moved in such a powerful way in my life to remind me that I have nothing to be angry about. As you heard in my introduction, or maybe you saw in the program tonight, I now work with survivors around the world. I now know of 209 other survivors much like me. And even though I am so grateful for each and every one of those lives, we are 209 in the face of 1 billion lives lost, 1 billion with a B, worldwide to abortion. I have nothing to be angry about. I was given the gift of health and a strong voice to serve God in a mighty way. I have nothing to be angry about. God gave me the gift of my amazing family. I have nothing to be angry about. But what I started to feel even at the age of 14 was incredible sadness. And not just for the children like me that will lose their lives to abortion, but I felt immense grief for my biological parents and the men and women like them that are facing an abortion decision. I didn't know back then that my birth mother was forced into her abortion, but what I felt in my heart is that her life had to have been forever changed after that day. And God set me out on a journey to find my biological parents, to let them know something very, very important, that they are loved, that they are forgiven. And I looked for them for over 10 years to offer them that message. I started looking for them when I was 19. I didn't find them until I was nearly 30. Anybody ever walked through a desert in their life where you're questioning God's plans for your life versus what you had in mind? Maybe you're questioning his timetable versus your calendar. I faced that in those 10 years. During those 10 years, I ended up moving to Sioux City, the very same city where my birth mother's abortion had taken place. I moved there to finish my master's degree in social work. I ended up working for the very same adoption agency that handled my adoption all those years before. Because God has a very funny sense of humor sometimes, doesn't he? He does. And after 10 years of searching for my biological parents and trying to obtain my medical records, there were days, I will honestly admit, there were days I would sit in my office at that adoption agency and think, I could just look in a file, right? Anybody else would think that after 10 years of searching? I hope so. I wanted to find my biological parents. I knew God was calling me forward to share his story with the world, but I wanted my birth parents to hear from me first. And so there were times that I thought I would peek in a file, but I didn't. Because in those 10 years, I had learned to fully trust in God's will for my life. And finally, after years and years of searching, in 2007, I finally found my biological parents. I finally obtained my medical records in his perfect timing. If you want to see copies of my medical records, they're just on my website. It's melissaohden, OHDEN.com. You can see parts of my medical records that I have shown to Congress twice now in the last year. And then they say things like, a saline infusion for an abortion was done, but was unsuccessful. Whew. That's an interesting statement, isn't it? In a world that often doesn't want to talk about what abortion truly is, my medical records are pretty clear. I'm only here tonight because an abortion didn't succeed in ending my life. And as hard as it was to read through some of those things, I ultimately experienced incredible joy. Because even though I spent 10 years searching for my biological family, even though I spent days in my office thinking I could just peek in a file, God's plan was greater once again. Because in my medical records, in one little box, they forgot to black out my birth parents' names. Amen? You were probably wondering where I was going with that whole sharing that I worked for the adoption agency. That's why I shared it. Because I could have committed a huge HIPAA violation by peeking in a file, right? But instead, what does God do? He creates or allows an even greater HIPAA violation to occur. Watch for his plans, folks. They don't always look the way we expect them to, but they are always a blessing. And it was an incredible blessing for me to determine who my biological parents were. And you're never going to guess what I discovered that very same night. When I started searching for my biological parents, I uncovered that I was living in the very same city as my biological father. I moved to Sioux City thinking I was moving there just to finish my master's degree. God's plan of transformation was much greater. There he was. And I prayed about it for months before I ultimately reached out to him. I ended up sending my biological father a letter the summer of 2007 to his office and not his home, trying to protect him a little bit. But I've told him all the things I've told you all tonight. I let him know that there we were in the very same city. And I let him know that I would be waiting if he ever wanted to communicate with me or have a relationship. It's been nearly 9 years now, and I'm still waiting. And that is okay. Think about how many years I was given to prepare for that possibility. And in reality, it's much more complicated, as you're going to hear about in just a second. Because sadly, abortion complicates people's lives. You know, that's another one of the reasons why I love this ministry. I think if you sat down with Lakita or other people who have come through the doors, they would tell you something quite different. It's not about complicating things at Bridgehaven, it's about simplifying things. I think you would hear women say, you know what, I had a chance to breathe. I was able to think, I was able to talk about what options exist for me. It didn't complicate things. But abortion has complicated the lives of my biological parents, and I'm going to share that with you here in just a moment. That same time, I turned my sights on my biological mother and her family. I actually couldn't find my birth mother through my searching because she married someone else not long after the abortion took place. But I found her parents. You know that grandmother that I told you all about? Have you ever done something and then you look back on it and go, wow, I can't believe I did that? That is like every single day of my life, folks. If you've ever wondered, what is it like to be in Melissa's shoes? I pretty much, at the end of every day, go, I can't believe I did that. But it's by the grace of God that I did that. And so, you know, looking back on it, I can't believe that I sent my grandparents a letter asking for them to reach out to my biological mother on my behalf. But I sure am grateful that I did it, because I think they probably needed to hear from me just as much as my birth mother did. I never expected to hear back from them because, of course, I hadn't heard back from my biological father. But within days, I received a letter in return. It was my grandfather. And in his letter, he admitted that my live birth was not the intention that day at the hospital. I think that was very courageous of him. And it was equally courageous for him to go on and talk about my biological family. He ultimately shared two things that point back to Bridgehaven. You know, he certainly wouldn't have understood that at the time, but now you will tonight. One of the things he shared is that my birth mother had never told anyone about her abortion, much like the letter Chelsea read already tonight. We know that my birth mother is not alone in that. And I want to echo what Chelsea has already shared. I want every woman and every man who has been touched by abortion to know that there is hope and there is healing and there is love and forgiveness to be found after an abortion. That's also why this ministry exists. You know, my grandfather closed his letter by letting me know one very important thing. My message of forgiveness would not be passed along because they were completely estranged from my biological mother. And it makes sense, doesn't it? When we now know what happened nearly 39 years ago, it makes great sense that their relationship has been forever changed. And I share that with you because even though what's happened in our lives is very dramatic, we are also not alone in that. And I want every family to have the opportunity to be healed from the pain of abortion. That time in 2007 was the last time I heard from my grandparents. And it's okay. I am totally at peace with that, everybody. It's okay. But that's also the very first time I came forward publicly with my story. If you can cue up that photo for me. The very first time I shared my story was on Capitol Hill out in Washington, D.C. Not a bad first speaking engagement straight out of the gate, right? And a really friendly place for somebody like me. No. If you're thinking it is, no, folks, it's not. But I go there anyway. But that first time I went out there, I was thinking, oh, thank you, Lord, for this opportunity, but I'm never going to do this again. Anybody else ever done that? And maybe like me, what you've uncovered over the years, or maybe what you'll learn tonight, is that God never calls on any of us to be able. He simply calls on us to be available. And when you make yourself available to him, you have all the gifts and skills you need to fulfill his calling for you in this world. Trust me, I am living proof of that. But that first time I was thinking, thank you, but no thank you, I am not a public speaker. Went home and told my husband about my bad case of nerves. What we quickly learned is that I had a really bad case of morning sickness. That's our oldest daughter, Olivia, that you see there on the screen. She is now 8 years old. And if you want to leave that photo up, I'm going to tell you about the man in the picture here in just a second. You know, it was during my pregnancy with Olivia that I got more involved in pro-life work. I ended up giving up my career to accept my calling. And I am here to encourage you tonight. You know, if God has been calling you to be involved with Bridgehaven and you're thinking, thank you, but no thank you, please answer the calling he has for you. Because I will tell you, there is no greater blessing for me in this world than doing what God has called me to do with my life, and I want other people to have that opportunity. But during my pregnancy with Olivia, here I was starting to travel around the world in defense of life. What I didn't know is that my birth father was back home at the same time fighting for his. That's why he never responded to my letter, because he passed away about 6 months after receiving it. And I only discovered that because I very innocently Googled his name one night on the internet. I opened up that hit from the Sioux City Journal, so excited to read about his life. But of course, what I read about was his passing. And I will admit that I questioned God that night. I questioned how this could be his plan. And I often say it's easy to believe in God's will when things go the way we plan them to. It's a whole other thing to believe in his will when things go otherwise. And in the midst of me questioning him, he spoke back very clearly to me. He said, Melissa, be patient. I know this is not your plan, but my plan is much greater. And as the months unfolded, I got to see that great plan. That great plan involved Olivia being born right there at St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa, the very same hospital where my life was supposed to end. Talk about God's hand of redemption stretching far and wide, right? But it gets even better than that. God's plan also involved the man that you see there on the screen. That's my grandfather, my biological father's father. When my birth father passed away, they went to clean out his office, and they found my letter tucked in his top desk drawer. Just as my birth mother had carried that secret in her life, so had he. And in the midst of their incredible shock and grief, they came into my life. You know, I know you can look upon his face and see the great joy and love in my grandfather's face. And I will tell you, we have experienced that love and joy now in the last 8 years that he and my great aunt have been involved in my life. I could stand here tonight and tell you that I have been able to be united with all the members of my birth father's family, but it's not that simple. Abortion has changed our family forever. And as hard as it is to see people still grappling with anger and grief and guilt, I take incredible hope knowing God is not done with them yet. And I also take my great hope in now seeing what is happening in my biological mother's family. Even though it's been many years since my grandparents contacted me, a cousin of hers reached out to me in 2013. That's how I know about the role my grandmother played in the abortion taking place. My cousin put me in contact with my 2 half-sisters, who I haven't met yet, but I communicate quite frequently with. And my cousin even opened the lines of communication with none other than my biological mother. And no, we have not met yet, but we are walking along that journey. And there is one particular reason why we haven't met yet. There was one final secret about my life that even my adoptive parents didn't know. And that is that my birth mother spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. It's like something out of a movie, isn't it? You know, I have come to accept and respect and appreciate the story of life that God has written for me. But if there is one thing I can change, I would change that very thing. Because everything you will ever read about how someone is affected physically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually by an abortion, I will tell you, my biological mother experienced those things. And when we first started communicating, she questioned how I could ever love her. She questioned how she could ever be forgiven by the decisions that were made about my life. And as hard as it was to see her walk through that, I now get to see her life being transformed. We are walking along the path to be meeting very, very soon. So if you ever wonder if you can pray for me, that is something that you can pray about more for her than it is for me. But I want you to think about this for a second. How many women in our world would give anything to be in my birth mother's shoes? I will tell you that it makes me weep because I get those emails. I get those phone calls from the women who say, could I be your mother? Let me be your mother. If you've ever wondered why this ministry is so important, I hope that you remember the words of all of those women. Not only so children like me can come into this world, so future generations like my darling girls, I'm a little biased, so future generations like our daughters can come into this world, so that more grandparents like my grandfather can experience their grandchildren. But yes, so women like my biological mother and men like my biological father can have a dramatically different experience. And so I want to thank you for your continued support of this ministry. I want to thank you for all that you do on behalf of lives like mine and people like my biological parents every single day. Thank you so much.